So, welcome everybody to this first evening panel of the conference. For some of you, it might be a morning panel or a night panel, maybe, depending on where in the world you are. It's really nice to have so many of you joining us still, even if it's been a long day and a full day. We have almost 300 people, and probably more people will be joining us as the breaks are over and formal session discussions ending. So my name is Tone Smith. I am a degrowth activist based in Vienna, and I am part of the organizing team of the conference, and I will be facilitating this panel discussion, which is called Understanding Transformations and the Role of Strategy. So before we enter into content and I present to you this evening's panel, I would like to share some practical information. First of all, for those of you who would like to listen to the German translation of the session, please go to the translation channel in Discord. There, we also have panels from the harvesting team. We have a harvesting team with us, which will provide graphical recordings after the session. They invite you to reflect and exchange ideas with each other in the harvesting room, Discord room. And there is, of course, the panel of the meeting itself. You might be familiar with this system by now. For all general discussions among the audience.
Sorry, Dennis, can you turn off your audio? It creates some echo.
Yes, so for all general discussions among the audience, such as immediate reactions to the panels or things you want to share with the audience, please use this dedicated Discord room in parallel while watching the live panel. The links for all these channels will be posted in the chat, or are already posted in the chat here at the webinar jam on the right-hand side. And this chat in the webinar jam will be used mainly for us posting messages to you, and also for you to post questions for the panelists. So later we will have a question and answer section, and please use the chat in this webinar jam to post questions for that, while use the Discord to discuss within the audience. Okay, so with all the practical issues done, I would like to introduce our speakers joining us today. We have Miriam Lang with us from Ecuador, where she is a professor at the Simón Bolívar University. We have Dennis Eversberg, who is a researcher at the Friedrich-Schiller-Universität in Jena in Germany. And we have Andreas Novy from the WU Wien, that is the Vienna University of Economics and Business. He is head of the Institute for Multi-Level Governance and Development, which is one of the hosting institutions for the conference. And then I am sad to announce that our fourth speaker, Maro Pantatsido, who is the Deputy Director for Global Strategy and Impact at Amnesty International, she's also a degrowth activist, will unfortunately not be able to join us today due to illness. And we are very sorry about that, especially since she was meant to bring to the debate specifically civil society and activist perspective. However, I would like to mention that all the panelists, speakers, even though they are academics, are also activists. So we still have the activist element with us. And with this, I would like to move on to the content of this panel. So this is what we want to bring to the panel, knowledge from academia into activism. We want to start with taking one step back and ask what we can learn from how change has happened historically, also with recent examples or further back in history, and to see also what we can learn from attempts which have failed. And in this way, we aim to get a better understanding of what transformation is and how it can happen. So in this way, we can be alert to potential obstacles, while also hopefully understand better the process of change and the mechanisms that can make change happen. And then, of course, we want to bring this into the discussion of how to build degrowth strategies. So the session will run in the following way. First, all the panelists will give an opening statement. And we will then have some time for interaction between the panelists and with some prepared questions from the organizer side before we move into questions and answers with questions from you, the public. We will should have at least roughly 30 minutes for that. And we are really keen to hear from you, so please post questions. And of course, then afterwards, the discussion can continue in Discord. So with that, I will initially be handing over to Andreas to kick us off. So thank you, everyone.
Welcome from my side. And thank you for the invitation. Transformations towards degrowth. I will start with Palani, the author of The Great Transformation, a book that deals with issues of transformation and will bring in some thoughts for discussion. He discusses two different types of transformation. First and foremost, Palani is known for his reflections on the transition from an agrarian to an industrial society. Such a profound change has only one precursor, the Neolithic revolution, from a society of hunters and gatherers to a sedentary society based on agriculture. Similar to the Industrial Revolution, both were industrial evolutionary processes. He compared it to a metamorphosis, a profound change from a caterpillar to a butterfly. A butterfly and a caterpillar are the same animal, but in appearance and functionality, they differ profoundly. Transformations lead to severe disruptions, radical changes in the way of living, housing, working, producing. This will not happen uncontested. Conflicts, struggles are unavoidable. As the decomposition of the word transformation shows, trans and form and ation, it is about the change of basic social forms. And it is the task of good science to help clarifying what the basic social forms are that have to change in this transition. Many would argue that growth imperative is one of these basic forms, and therefore degrowth is one of the cornerstones of the contemporary transformation. Without going into detail, there is a second, less known meaning to transformation by Palani. When he talks about the great transformation, Palani was talking about conflicts, struggle, a rupture, a political revolution that happened in the 1930s. Liberal capitalism collapsed because of its belief in self-regulated markets and individualism. It led to a more statist, organized, and deglobalized socio-economic order, ranging from Stalin's socialism in one country to fascism and Roosevelt's New Deal. The key lesson from Palani is the two concepts of transformation, first as a long-term process, and that's the transformation towards degrowth, and second, as a short-term political situation of conflict and struggle, and they have to be analyzed together. To take a historical example from the city of Vienna, planned to be host of this degrowth conference, Red Vienna, an ambitious municipal reformism implemented between 1919 and 1934, led to long-term changes in Vienna's urban infrastructure by building 60,000 apartments for social housing, by diverse public leisure facilities for all inhabitants, by innovations in education, social assistance, and public health. It was a local experiment for what later became the welfare state, the national welfare state, with decommodified important parts of collective provisioning, especially free access to education and health. These long-term transformations, which shaped the city until today, were possible because from the bottom up, a strong social movement, especially trade unions and cooperatives, and a well-organized party won elections and implemented top-down from above public policies for collective provisioning. While social democracy is often linked to policies of wage increases and mass consumption, Red Vienna focused on creating social ecological infrastructures accessible for all, affordable and sustainable. Before ecological awareness was a public concern, these infrastructures, from accessible public transport to social housing and public swimming pools, have sustained quality of life by satisfying basic needs without individual consumption. Instead of raising individual income, they reduced the cost of living. It was a form of just transition compatible with what today is the degrowth agenda for overcoming individualizing consumerism. This created equality in everyday life in effective ways, so effective that the political right abolished the experiment with a civil war in 1934. What can we learn from Palani and Red Vienna for contemporary transformations in the middle of a large pandemic? COVID-19 has, for the first time after many decades, led to a substantial reduction of CO2 emissions and related material throughput. This really existing degrowth, not at all planned, has been more effective than decades of transformational efforts, neither mainstream market liberal policies from above, nor the multitude of spontaneous civic organization from below in communities of like-minded individuals have had a comparable impact. Palani was a fierce critic of liberalism, a philosophy that permeates contemporary life and thinking. Many liberals and many degrowthers share the desire for the implementation of an alternative society free of all types of compulsion, especially state coercion. We heard something about this in the morning session. But according to Palani, this is illusionary, and I cite Palani, no such thing is possible in a complex society. This becomes apparent. End of citation. And indeed, the current pandemic shows the decisive role of coercion in combating a virus. But not only this, also applied for a different purpose, the policies led to substantial shrinking of economic activities. Decades of manifestations of bottom-up initiatives have not been able to stop the growth imperative, with all the positive elements that they have had, consciousness, awareness raising it, etc. But a few weeks of systemic deglobalization have led to a decrease of CO2 emissions. Shutdown is definitively not a desirable policy, but it is effective. Individual civic communal niche activities, be it in food cooperatives, eco-villages or repair cafes, are valuable as personal commitment, but focusing on them tends towards depoliticizing the movement, and it denies what Palani calls the reality of society, complex human organizations, bureaucracies, international division of labor, competing interest, violence. Experienced by all of us the last weeks, change does not, I cite Palani, spring from human volition. Non-cooperation is impossible in regard to them. The function of power is to ensure that mechanism of conformity which is needed for the survival of the group. The invisible hand will not defeat the pandemic. An effective public health policy in poor countries like Vietnam can. A multitude of spontaneous grassroots initiatives will not solve climate emergency. Social ecological infrastructures built by collective institutions can. I'm convinced that increased power of the state will be a lasting consequence of the pandemic. This is not necessarily good news. It might lead to ugly forms of authoritarianism and nationalism. As an alternative to fascism in the 1930s, Palani proposed democratic deliberation on how to regulate and plan the economy to achieve what he called freedom, not only for the few, but for all. Today, again, the only feasible transformative strategy consists of diverse components, but crucially, another form of public organization, a decentralized state, and civic public partnerships. This requires political agency to transform public institutions, to change bureaucracies, to improve laws and regulations, the stony road of pragmatism, inspired by a concrete utopia of a good life for all. In the 21st century, a transformation will happen anyhow, but its concrete form will be shaped by agency from above and from below. Organization, planning, and regulation are necessary, and they cannot be implemented without coercion. Trusting in pedagogical means to convince Trump, Bolsonaro, and their militant, sometimes paramilitary supporters is illusionary. Power and authority will be necessary, but power and authority can be and are abused, as Miriam Lang will tell us in a few minutes, with respect to Latin America. The point is, and that is for me the key lesson from Karl Polanyi for our discussion here on degrowth, there is no alternative to trying again to experiment with new forms of democracy, with activism from below, with civic organization and public administration. That's my introductory statement. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Andreas. Thank you very much for your input, which I believe might have been quite provocative also for some degrowth advocates, especially maybe your comparison of the current recession with degrowth, or equating liberals with degrowthers. I can imagine we'll see some debate about that in the Discord chat, and maybe have some questions later. So let's see how that goes. Now I would like to hand over to our next speaker, which is Dennis. Please, Dennis. We will have some slides also now. Yeah, thank you. We cannot hear you, Dennis. You need to turn on your microphone.
Good point. Thanks a lot, and thanks a lot to the organizers for inviting me. I think it's a great honor for me to be able to speak on this panel, and I thought quite a bit about what I could say, and thought it would make sense to say some things about research that I did on the degrowth movement. I did a study on the degrowth movement in 2014 within the context of the Post-Growth Societies Research Group at the University of Jena. I'm a sociologist by training, and you will notice that during the slides. I tried to figure out, among other things, what people in the degrowth spectrum think about transformation and what ideas about transformation they have. And I thought I'd start from there for this presentation. So we've assembled here under the banner of degrowth, but what is it that we're up against if this implies we oppose growth? Let me just say that to my mind, and we discussed a lot about this in the Post-Growth Societies Research Group here in Jena, growth stands not for a mere logic or paradigm, but for an abstract escalatory imperative that is embedded in the very structure of modern capitalist societalization that creates and maintains relations of domination specific to capitalist modernity and that yields destructive consequences. As a slogan, degrowth states quite clearly that we want this to end. Fair enough, but how? I read the sound quality is not very good. I'm trying to stay as close as possible. So, but how? How do you end an abstract imperative? I want to look at this not through the lens of theoretical debates, but through the ideas and practices of actual activists at the grassroots level. Let's look at some results from a survey that Matthias Schmerz and myself conducted at the Leipzig Degrowth Conference in 2014 to illustrate the different answers to this question that are present within the degrowth spectrum. Eric Olin Wright has proposed a typology of 4 basic strategies for overcoming capitalism: smashing, taming, eroding, and escaping capitalism. I've adapted these here and located them within the field of practices of degrowth activism. The vertical axis distinguishes between more top-down approaches, thinking from the societal level near the top, and more bottom-up approaches centered on community at the bottom, while the horizontal stretches from gradualist or reformist concepts on the right to radically antagonistic or revolutionary ones on the left. Now, in our survey, we could distinguish between 5 different currents among the conference participants, which also stand for different concepts of transformation. The first one, associated with the rupture model of transformation, is the smallest one, which we have called modernist rationalist left. It stands for classical leftist and eco-socialist positions, a structure-oriented anti-capitalism that remains rooted in a belief in social progress. The strategy here is mainly to engage in theoretical analysis to prepare for an all-out revolution to come one day, sooner or later. The problem about this is that this kind of approach is extremely abstract, and it's hard to gauge what that kind of revolution actually means. The historical prototype, though, that people aspire to is the Russian Revolution. Now, the second, that's in the top left. The second in the top right, which you could call the transition model of transformation, I call imminent reformism. This is a current of people who believe in technology and in progressive change within the existing institutions. This current is opposed to both anti-modernist and to revolutionary ideas, and it comes with strategic orientations somewhere between green growth and growth transcendent reforms. The problem is, of course, that it's easily co-opted into new growth coalitions. Its historical prototype, you could say, is the creation of welfare states in mid-20th century Europe. Thirdly, in the gradualist and bottom-up corner is the change model. The voluntarist, pacifist, idealist current we found here believes that we should overcome the religion of growth. It adheres to the vision of peaceful bottom-up transformation. Everybody engages in fair and sustainable practices and projects. Others see how great it is and join in. And it's strongly focused on everyday practice as a starting point of far-reaching change. Critics tend to object that despite what this current believes, this strategy has a very limited appeal. It's only attractive to an urban middle-class academic milieu, and that it doesn't actually aspire to any real opposition at all. Its prototype, you could say, are the gradual societal changes induced by the post-1968 new social movements. And fourthly, there's the exodus model of transformation, embodied by a current clumsily named sufficiency-oriented critique of civilization. It stands for a stark eco-radicalism, a fierce critique of modern society, and the preferred strategy is to build resilient communities that will be able to survive the coming collapse of modern society. Oft-heard objections against this include that it naturalizes community and that its escapism discounts political struggle. As a prototype, think of eco-villages. That's rather in the bottom center. Now, there was a fifth current in our analysis of the survey. And as Matthias and myself argued back then, this is the current that most closely represents what is new in degrowth. The alternative practical left, located close to the center of the spectrum in both dimensions. I think it stands for a fifth approach to transformation, one that has learned from the historical failures and partial successes of the four models, and that attempts to dialectically mediate both the community society and the gradualism antagonism tensions in a new way. Let's call this the dismantlement approach. So what's that alternative practical left? We found it stands for an anarchist-inspired radical critique of capitalism and modernity with feminist anti-colonial elements in which global social and environmental justice are pursued as the ultimate goals. It's both structural and immediatist, and it has radical and pragmatic tendencies. I think it stands for a fifth transformational paradigm that has emerged around degrowth and that we might call dismantlement. As has been said time and again, degrowth is a movement of the global north, and the The notion of dismantlement is borrowed from a debate in the German internationalist movement in the 1990s about the dismantlement of the North. So we're speaking from the North here, we're talking about the North, and our purpose is ending what the North stands for. So our image of transformation then is dismantling the machinery of growth and domination, or as I put it, dismantling the imperial mode of production and living. Think of dismantling a factory. Dismantling something is a planned and purposeful collective endeavor to take apart something that has material, infrastructure, social, institutions, and mental beliefs and ideas, dimensions, all of which were historically made with great effort and can only be removed through a lot of work. What you engage in when doing this is not to smash something, but to rearrange and repurpose its parts, leaving some infrastructures and institutions in place, using others differently, changing connections, and thus removing the clear boundary between what you dismantle and your surroundings, and its surroundings. I'm trying to speak into the microphone. You don't try to tame or water down the logic of the whole, but to dissolve that very whole by departing from what exists to invent new structures and institutions as platforms for new pathways. You don't try to individually carry away brick by brick to erode the structure, but you engage in collective practices directed at seeding, depriving yourselves of the means formerly used to control the labor of others and to dominate nature. And you don't just walk away and pitch your tent across the street to watch the walls cave in by themselves, but you actively engage and challenge the forces and means of production. Dismantlement is not itself a strategy, it's a frame of reference that lends an overarching meaning to a whole host of practices and struggles. The common denominator to practices of protest and civil disobedience against extractive and destructive industries, to radical policy proposals for non-reformist reforms, to solidarity with migrants against militarized border regimes, calls for disarmament and demilitarization, or forms of self-transformation by creating environments in which one can be someone different that can invent new forms of society. The common denominator to all this is that they contribute in some way to dismantling the power structure. The key step, however, would probably be large self-organization projects operating at a regional or federal state level. If there are any prototypes for this kind of thing, the Zapatista uprising in Chiapas or the Kurdish self-organization in Rojava are probably the closest thing on record. And finally, just a few key takeaways to make sure I get my main points across. Growth isn't just a paradigm, but an imperative deeply entrenched in the material infrastructures, social relations, and collective imaginaries of modern capitalist societies, and that's defended by organized interests. It needs to be challenged at all of these levels. Don't underestimate its structural persistence. And degrowth is in the North should be aware our own modes of thinking and acting are invariably in some way shaped by capitalist modernity. Degrowth critique must include self-critique. Overcoming the escalatory imperative requires working in, against, and beyond modern capitalist society. We can't just step outside. And a really central final point, it's ultimately about inventing different emancipatory modes of societalization, of creating society, rather than simply replacing society with community. Thanks a lot. That's it from me, and I'm hoping for a fruitful discussion.
Thank you very much, Dennis. Unfortunately, the sound wasn't so good all the time, but you had very good slides, so most of the information is there for those of you who would like to see it again later in the recording. You can focus on the slides and the text there, and there is really a rich amount of information in his slides. So yeah, thanks for this rich description of approaches to social change within the degrowth spectrum. We will now pass the word on to Miriam, who we've asked to think about these issues from a Global South perspective. Of course, the Global South is a big part of the world, and you will mention that yourself, Miriam, I think, when you talk generally about the issue, and sometimes from a Latin American perspective, or also more from the global South perspective. So please, Miriam.
Thank you very much to have organized this interesting panel, and also thank you to my excellent co-panelists, which I will refer to, as you will see, in many ways. So I have been asking myself first what we can learn from the history of systemic transformation. And together with people like Boaventura de Sousa Santos from Portugal, I think that today it is rather obvious that the theoretical and political instruments for systemic social transformation that we have inherited from the 19th and 20th centuries, like the reform or revolution debate, or later the debate that opposed armed struggle to elections as routes to taking power, are mainly insufficient to address the challenges in the 21st century. Nevertheless, I think there is one crucial lesson that we can learn from those experiences of previous centuries, where people not only fought each other, but they even killed each other because of disagreeing about transformation strategies. As we live in a complex world, and there are undoubtedly many layers to the type of systemic transformation sought after by degrowth movements, there just cannot be one single path, nor one single privileged actor or framework of transformation. So we must think of multiple paths toward transformation. I think Dennis's research is very instructive about that, as a kind of ecosystem of transformative strategies, which flourish in diverse contexts and on several scales, and combine different temporalities, as Andreas already mentioned, referring to Karl Polanyi, short-term urgent action and long-term transformative action. Those strategies are never exclusive, but complementary to each other. The only criterion they must fulfill is that they move into the right direction, slowly or rapidly, but away from any false solution that pretends, just as an example, to maintain the destructive logics of individual greed, infinite growth, and private appropriation, while only greening markets, productions, and consumption. And another crucial ability for transformative strategies is the ability to learn collectively from past errors, own ones and those of others. So this inspires me to talk about more recent experiences of transformation in Latin America, so we can learn from them. With a series, and this is my second point I want to address in this talk, with a series of progressive governments in many countries. Until recently, Latin America went through what we can call the biggest experiment of radical social transformation of our times. It contained various dimensions that were aligned with degrowth. For example, when Buen Vivir, or living well in English, was proposed as an alternative paradigm to linear development. The main strategic bet was on exerting transformative power through the government using state institutions. But in spite of exceptionally favorable geopolitical conditions, the intended systemic transformation toward Buen Vivir has not been achieved in any country. Rather, this transformative horizon ended up being resignified, even cannibalized by the dynamics inherent to modern colonial, patriarchal, and capitalist states. And today, we face the situation that it is the extreme right who is shaping a fair share of the common sense in Latin American societies. And the extractivist aggression of vital ecosystems like the Amazon has only intensified. Now, in the aftermath of this progressive cycle, the Latin American debates about transformation strategies are rather polarized. Some forces who ought to identify themselves as left and are predominantly organized in political parties simply ignore the outcome and continue to consider the state as the single most powerful tool to perform social change in a top-down manner. Others, more focused on territorial transformation from below and on mainly rural communities, see all institutional spheres as part of the problem and ignore that many of the rich processes of autonomy only exist because they are protected from the transnational appetites of corporations through some legal framework or some high court sentence. And sadly, in the best tradition of the 20th century left, both currents consider each other enemies. What I think is tragic about this situation is that one of the main reasons why transformation could not be achieved is rooted in this polarization itself. If social movements had not demobilized once progressive forces were in government, but had accompanied each policy with critical mobilization in order to maintain the societal power relations that had swept these new political forces into the executive. And if governments and their new parties had not understood their new task as primarily staying in power and had not prioritized short-term results over structural transformation, if they had not repressed any critical expression from organized society as a threat to themselves, then maybe a more important counterweight to the imperatives of dependency in the capitalist world system could have been built. So this brings me to my second point, which is the question, still building on that experience of how to deal with institutions when aiming at systemic transformation. Drawing on the debates we have in the Latin American Working Group on Alternatives to Development, I would like to say that the changes achieved through social struggles do need certain degrees of institutionalization in order to gain durability. Because too often, once mobilization declines, there is a backlash with respect to what had been achieved in struggle. But the big question is, what kind of institutionalization? Generally, when institutions are mentioned, we automatically think of public institutions as part of the state. But there is also the possibility to create institutions from below, transformative, anti-systemic institutions. In Latin America, our debates about how to relate to existing institutions are rather blinded. One current sticks to the blueprint of the welfare state, as if this could be a generalizable model for all countries of the planet. And that was, in fact, the promise of progressive governments. But really, welfare states only existed in some northern countries for only some decades and were paid for by extremely accelerated and destructive economic growth, externalizing destruction and exploitation to the global south. The other approach, also problematic, is to simply ignore existing institutions as an important playing field of transformation that ought to be disputed. Instead of aspiring to take over national government, which I think has historically proven ineffective for radical systemic transformation, we must occupy certain strategic positions within existing institutional frameworks, from where, for example, we can help to enable territorial struggles and enhance the role of prefigurative practices. Practices through which people can experience the advantages of change in an embodied manner. Systemic transformation needs to change existing institutions through strong social organization and mobilization. But at the same time, it must create own transformative institutions. For example, like introducing local or regional currencies, which have the potential to lead, and in some cases have led, to a relative decoupling from globalized, unsustainable markets. I think this is really crucial for the global south, but not only, as the Swedish Alf Hornborg proposes, for example. So now I will come to my final point, which is the question how degrowth can address and confront the capitalist world system as such. Because I am convinced that one of the most important strategic challenges that degrowth movements face is to transcend the instruments and means that are available at the national scale while imagining transformative strategies. Like this concentration on the national scale and also a certain kind of Eurocentrism. Right now, at this moment, there is much discussion going on about what a Green New Deal could mean. And it is called Global Green New Deal in some of its variants. But it runs the risk to just ignore that even a socially just transition to sustainable energy, mobility, and so forth in the North would still be built on ongoing extraction, dispossession, and environmental destruction in the geopolitical South. And if degrowth pretends systemic change, it necessarily must tackle the deep asymmetries, the historical and present injustices of our current world system. Degrowth cannot be just about reducing consumption, material and energy throughput, and reorganizing societies around care in the global North. It must aim at enabling communities in all parts of the world to produce their own lives collectively and according to their own contextualized needs. So this puts the issue of redistribution on the degrowth agenda as a priority. And I mean redistribution not only understood in terms of wealth and income, but also of other dimensions of the material means necessary to reproduce life, even outside capitalist markets, as there is the access to land, to woods, to water, and to seeds, for example. Degrowthers must leave behind the narrative of development, which is so closely associated with that of growth, which conceives the global South as one homogeneous territory that somehow has to do some catching up before being able to join degrowth strategies. We must understand that poverty is not a residual problem of the past, which is incrementally being overcome through things like development and aid. Poverty is the ongoing result of constant, present appropriation of cheap or unpaid labor and nature in peripheral regions of our planet. Those regions are also characterized themselves by deep inequalities. Degrowth movements must create the conditions for a horizontal dialogue with those other regions, those other actors, which continue to make possible overconsumption in the North through a constant resource transfer, even if those other actors do not call themselves degrowthers. These are crucial allies for any systemic transformation, and we need to create our own institutions and paths to make that dialogue, that reparation and redistribution possible. Thank you very much. That's from me for now.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Miriam, for your input and also for raising the issue of the narrative of development. I think a narrative which has been haunting the degrowth movement for some time. And for those interested and not so aware of the literature, there is also a whole strand of post-development, post-colonialist literature that you might want to look into. Now, there's been some questions about literature on what's been discussed. Please post those questions in Discord and then post questions that you would like the panelists to answer in the discussion here in the webinar jam chat. Yeah, so thank you all panelists. We will have a little round of debate because we're trying to have a panel debate even if we're not in the same room. So we've prepared a question for each of you, and we will also allow you to comment on each other's input. And after that, we will move to questions from the audience, which is already starting to come in. So that's very nice. Yeah, I will go back to Andreas, and we have quite some reflection on your input, Andreas. Picking up a couple of things in one go. So you refer to what Palani calls the reality of society that has to be accepted. And this sounds a little bit like an essentialist definition of the nature of modern society somehow, while degrowthers want to rather change the society radically by changing some of the things you mentioned, like, for example, the international division of labor, complexity of society, and so on. So isn't what you're saying then, or what Palani is saying, a little bit like another version of TINA, there is no alternative, or of the strategy of sustainable development, or eco-modernism, which we've seen now for some decades, which has failed. And if we put it a bit differently, we could also maybe refer this to the issue of pragmatism, appealing to the state and its institutions and bureaucracy. How can we make this to suddenly work? Because isn't pragmatism exactly what has led to the cooptation of the radical agenda, which is a topic that Dennis also touched upon in his presentation. Yeah, domination by vested interest and growth dependency is really what the modern state is characterized by. So even strong movements that we're seeing now, like Fridays for the Future, have not really accomplished to change very much about that. This was what I was thinking about then. How can this happen? How can you highlight political agency as a requirement, but exactly what do you mean by it? What does it mean for a degrowth strategy? That we should work through political parties or conventional party lines, or are you thinking about something else or broader? So if you would like to say something on that to start with, and also you're allowed to comment on the other speakers, as I said. Please, Andreas.
Yeah. The reality of society. I think I will use, to be short, two meanings of reality. The one thing is we have to be aware of what is decisive is reality in the sense of critical realism as a philosophy of science. That means what is happening. Many of us are concerned with climate change, with loss of biodiversity. And when I talk about reality, I talk about the increasing or decreasing dynamics in these directions. And that's why I made the reference to the totally unintended decrease of economic activity and of destruction as a byproduct of the corona crisis. And it are these phenomena that we have to take more attention of, because they are decisive, because what is decisive, in fact, is how much emissions are put into the atmosphere, how much biodiversity is destroyed. And that means we need a larger picture.
Please, Andreas, can you hold your microphone a bit closer? Then we can hear you even better.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
We need a broader picture, and we need especially to take into account that there are many interests and actors who have different ideas and opinions with respect to degrowth. And when I talk about the reality of society, and Palani talks about this, that means in simple language to take into account their adversaries as well. I totally agree with Miriam that the question of institutions is interesting and we need some type of institutionalizing from the bottom up. I totally agree. But these institutions, and that's why I talk about the specific form of institution infrastructures, these institutions are not only the building up of the like-minded people that agree with the degrowth agenda, but we need the bottom-up building of institutions that include practices also from those who at the moment want to practice other ways of their social and ecological everyday life. And that implies coercion, that implies struggle, and that implies some type of authority that asserts that the car is not the dominant means of production of mobility in a city. And if we want another type of mobility system, we need exactly building up other types of practices and routines. And in this respect, I take up one point from Dennis that I totally agree. We must not replace society by community. And that's somehow a danger that I see, that by not talking about how to deal with the opponents, enemies, those who don't like what we want, that we will not be able to implement other types of practices that go in the direction of systemic change. And social ecological infrastructures, as I presented, exactly have this advantage that they implement different routines for all inhabitants of a territory, and that is necessary for effective strategies, because not effective are strategies that remain restricted to those already convinced, and assuming that this group will increase and grow and finally become more than those with another worldview and business as usual strategies. That's, to be short, my perception of the reality of society in the sense of taking power and conflict more systematically into account, but not only in the way of resisting existing structures, but in building alternative ones that are compatible with much less use of resources and destruction on humans and nature.
Thank you very much, Andreas, for following up on that and for also commenting on making links to the other speakers. I would next like to turn to Miriam, because you both, Andreas and Miriam, you both focus on institutions and the need for institutional change. Or the need for institutionalization of social struggles to ensure that change is generalized and consolidated, is what you said, Miriam. And you suggested that we must occupy certain strategic positions within existing institutions and also create our own transformative institutions. Could you elaborate a bit more on that? Who are we, and what kind of institutions and strategic positions you're thinking about? And also maybe some examples to help us imagine what this could be. So please, Miriam.
Yes, of course. Thanks, Tony. Actually, I do not so much mean to institutionalize the struggles themselves, not at all, but the things, the changes that struggles fight for and achieve sometimes. And I think a very important thing is that the struggles remain alive. The mobilization does not die out. because in the moment it dies out, and that was precisely our experience with the progressive government, people thought, okay, now we're in power, and so we can go home and just rest after a strong cycle of anti-neoliberal struggles. And everything was passed over to those in government, underestimating completely how complex it would be to inhabit the structure, the apparatuses of the state, which just turned around a series of very renowned activists in a short period of time, and they began to function for the purpose of the stabilization of capital accumulation, although they worked radically against that before getting to power. And I think this is an experience that is recurrent, both with, let's say, social democrats in Europe and also progressive forces now in Latin America. And we can find many, many examples in history that it's not about taking power, but about and it's not about sending our best people, like from social movements, to be a minister or something, but we have to think what will happen then. Like, it's not, the achievement is not having someone in the state institutions. The achievement would be to maintain some sort of exchange with that person in spite of the temporalities and rhythms that the state imposes on those persons, and to preserve important social leaders outside the state so they can still activate society for this agency that Andreas also points out is so necessary. The examples for strategic occupying, I will give two sets of examples. One for the strategic occupation of certain points in the state institutions. For example, I think it is very, very important to have a significant representation, a sufficient representation in parliaments. For example, to be able to bring forward new laws that would regulate the change. For example, all that has happened in Germany around this energy law that allowed people to sell renewable energies to public grids has actually achieved change. But also, for example, in Ecuador here, when we had the Constitutional Assembly, it was crucial to have many, many representatives of social movements in this assembly to be able to install Buen Vivir as a paradigm of transformation in the constitution. Now, what had happened there is that the other half of the assembly still insisted on having development also in the constitution, and so they coexist in a very contradictory manner. And then the balance of power after the acceptation of the constitution in a referendum was not strong enough outside the state in order to push state institutions to really implement what Buen Vivir could mean. And then the developmentalists won. That's what I would say. So high courts, for example, have ruled here in Latin America in many ways and in many examples against the expansion of the frontiers of extractivism. And they are one of the few instruments, for example, indigenous people can refer to or appeal to in order to protect their territories. The Colombian High Court is very famous for that, but also international human rights courts like the Inter-American Human Rights Court. And so I think, those are examples for just occupying certain spots in the state that will be crucial to make changes when they are needed, or to prevent also a regression. And other examples would be for this implementation from institutionalization from below. For example, you have in in Colombia, for many years after 2008, there has been the so-called Congress of Peoples, which was a big gathering of lots of social movements, territorial organizations, even autonomously organized territories from African, Colombian, and indigenous peoples, but also trade unions and urban movements, and they all came together around certain topics in order to legislate from below and say, okay, this is a mandate that we express toward all state institutions and mayors at whatever scale, what we think the country should move into which direction. And that has had a certain impact. Now we also have a different situation in Colombia, but I think it's an inspiring example of how this institutionalization from below can even reach a national level. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Miriam. I will now move to Dennis, and I'm thinking about the issue of power, because it was discussed earlier in the morning panel today about how to build counter power. And in this respect, I was thinking that this dismantlement approach, or the fifth approach that you present, whether you have thought about the effectiveness of this approach also with respect to power, maybe because you were quite descriptive in your presentation. And I wanted also to link that to what you said about reconfiguration of the that voids the very possibility of control. This is quite a different claim than what Andreas is discussing about, or focusing on, with insistence on state planning and also the coercion, to use his words. So please, Dennis, I hand over to you.
Well, firstly, I'm not sure I'm that much opposed to Andreas on that count, because what I meant by voiding the very possibility of control was control over the labor of others. So it was not a question of political power or state institutions, but it's a question of are you in a position, that's what the imperial mode of living is, are you in a position to appropriate others' labor, and are you in a position to appropriate extracted nature? That's what I meant by voiding the very possibility of control, and that's a question of talking about, well, are we talking about relations of production, or are we talking about means of production and forces of production? And, I said we need a critique of the machine itself, and not just of who owns it. That's what I was talking about in that instance. And the question, I think, of political power is an altogether different one, or maybe not altogether, but it's a different one. I'm hard pressed about questions of counter power about this. I'm not so sure about it. I think my ideas really run more along John Holloway's lines of, changing the world without taking power. I'm probably closer to Miriam in that respect. Yeah, I wasn't even trying to answer that question, but by dismantling, I was trying to give a frame of reference that would allow people in the degrowth tradition or in the degrowth spectrum to think about, to give a different kind of meaning to the things they do, to figure out for themselves what this means with respect to power. And that of course then touches on the question of the effectiveness of dismantlement. It's difficult to say how it can be made more effective. It's there's a lot of movements and a lot of processes, I think, that can contribute to an effectiveness. I mean, if you look back to 2015-16 in Germany, a lot of people were actively practicing solidarity with refugees coming to Germany, and if this would go on, it would amount to an effective questioning of the structures of being able to exclude others from the imperial mode of living. So that would be one example that you can at least hope that there might be potentials within the population to be able to, or to want to actively contribute to things that will amount to giving up power and control. But you see, I'm kind of I don't really know.
Dennis, I will read a question to you that Nina wrote on the chats while you have the word. So she says, what do you, Dennis, mean with creating societies differently and not just community? I found that very interesting. Can you please elaborate?
Yeah, I mean, that's heavy-duty sociology. The notion of society is pretty much the most difficult notion in sociology. So, I mean, it probably makes sense to just explain what that is. I mean, community is sort of the thing, the kind of relation and the kind of social structure that is composed of direct relations between people. That is tied to the concrete individuals that enter into relations with each other, that exist in relations with each other. So, family is a basic unit of community, and it's basically everybody exists in some kind of community. Those are the relations of your everyday experience, the people that you interact with on a daily basis. There always is something like that. And people easily tend to think these kinds of direct, warm relations that we have with each other, aren't they a good model for what society as a whole should be? But society isn't that. Society, the totality of what there is in social structure in a given space is not simply an adding up of these direct relations of community, but it necessarily entails abstract relations between people. It necessarily entails rules and institutions that do not take account of who you are specifically, what you owe somebody, and what specific way you are related to someone. Society means that there are institutions and sets of rules that do not take account of these things. Modernity, of course, has seen an unending growth of these things. The question really is not how do we free ourselves of these abstract rules. I mean, it's to a lot of people, it seems cold, it seems alienating, it seems this is the thing that we don't really want. We all want to be friends and love each other. But that's not how society can work. And that's not how we can come to terms with each other at a global scale. And I think the question is really if we're all, and I think that's a human need, for all part of communities in some way. And I think degrowth transformation will have to rely in some way on a stronger concept of community than the society we live in now. The question will really be how do we find rules, global rules? I mean, not global in the sense for all of the globe, but rules for that encompass all of society that actually regulate how you can switch between communities. I think you need to live in some kind of community, and you need to be dependent on other people. Other people are always dependent on each other. And there must be relations of care. You can't live without them. But this must not become repressive. This must not become something that exerts power and domination over the individual. And a lot of kinds of communities tend to evolve toward that very quickly. And therefore, the question is, how can you change? How can you get out of one community that you're not comfortable with because the rules there don't really work for you, and how can you move somewhere else? That I think is really important, and if you think society, Dennis,
I think you're very engaged and it's really great, but I think you need to just round off that question and we'll take some more questions. Yeah? Okay, thanks a lot. We have quite a lot of interesting questions, so I was thinking now that I will read out 4 questions, and we will pass the word around to the panelists, and then you can answer the one or the ones that you find most relevant for you or would like to answer. So one question is in relation to what Miriam says about the institutions, but any one of you, I guess, might have an opinion on this. Can we retransform the existing institutions like NATO, UN, or is it better that we create new ones? Then Joanna has asked, thoughts about the risk of degrowth being co-opted or having its radical potential neutralized as we attempt to build momentum and win allies for the more top-down policy proposals? ? Jennifer Hinton asks, I don't think I have heard any mention of critical mass yet in any talks at this conference. Any thoughts on critical mass? Many experts have said that a critical mass can actually be relatively small in order to make larger societal shifts happen. For example, 3 to 10% of the population. I guess this is also one of those truths that the Extinction Rebellion movement is building on. And finally, the 4th question, why were progressive governments unable to carry out lasting transformations? And the last one, I would like to add a question to Andreas about Red Vienna, because I think Red Vienna is a really interesting example of a success, which then was actually overthrown. And this is yet another kind of obstacle for us in the degrowth movement to think about, maybe, that how do we avoid being pushed back once we manage to have a transformation. So with those questions, I will first hand over to Miriam this time. And just to remind of time, we have 18 minutes left, so 3 to 4 minutes each, and then we have a few minutes for roundup at the end. Please, Miriam.
Thank you. So the first question, can we retransform existing institutions like NATO or the UN? That are really hard examples. I think we can transform existing institutions, and I could talk a lot about very nice examples of that. For example, at the municipal level, where the relation between an organized citizenship and the institution is rather direct, and you can exert direct pressure. I think our reflections on how to transform institutions in a systemic way are really still beginning. And what we should do is see what are the societal needs that exist. What would society need from a global institution today? And to which extent do these existing institutions fulfill these needs? And much more than thinking of how we can transform an institution like the UN, which is in the first place a gathering of governments, which are not always legitimate in their own countries, we should think, how can we imagine a sort of global coordination that really addresses the urgent needs of our human societies today? That would be my answer to that. The critical mass question sounds rather theoretical to me, like I have to assess some truth that has been stated somewhere. I don't know. I think we are witnessing lots of landslide transformations that have been unexpected, and I think it is important to try to build broad alliances and to mobilize as many people as we can, but I would not pretend to know what percentage is needed for that. And the progressive governance question, I thought I already had related to that. There are many reasons. One is the dependency in the geopolitical sense in the world system, like when raw material prices went down, the illusion of welfare that had been built during these years, 10 years, 15 years of progressive governments, just imploded and nothing was there to be redistributed. And also the infrastructures that had been built could not be sustained in the same way. So this is why I insist so much on the issue of redistribution, because the social ecological infrastructures Andreas is talking so much about, they are very nice in Europe, and they should be here too in Latin America and Africa. But without a global redistribution of the possibilities of building them, and without thinking of who would do that, facing the states that we have with their problems of coloniality and inbuilt corruption, because we have governments that only have served foreign interests for decades. And this is the political culture that we actually face here. How do we get to the even possibility of building satisfactory social ecological infrastructures, for example, in transport, for example, in health, taking into account that our experiences here in Ecuador, both with the public health system now in the corona situation and with public transport, are rather catastrophic. So this aim has to be thought globally. And I think that instead of thinking about global rules that apply for the whole globe, we should think about rules for ourselves in our region that do not step on the possibilities of other regions to build their own transformations and shape them. In the term of a certain self-restriction, that the Indian word Swaraj means, like, my freedom is limited where I begin to step on the possibilities of your or others' freedom. And this is what the Global North systematically does not do.
Thanks a lot, Miriam, also for following up on that issue about the narrative of development or related to that. Next, I will pass the word on to Dennis. Would you like to answer or comment on one or two of these questions, please?
Yeah, well, transforming global institutions, I think NATO is an institution that's probably not up for transformation, but rather for disbandment. But the UN, I think, thinking that you should do away with it altogether, I don't think is a good idea. It certainly isn't the best of institutions around, but I'd start from there. It's not one of the pieces of the machinery and growth and domination that I would discard first. No, I think it's possible to transform institutions and to use them for different purposes, and we need to think a lot about doing that, because you can't just throw away all the work that historically went into these things, because it's always a great effort for societies to come up with things that includes institutions, and yeah, it's not about just smashing stuff. But the critical mass question is possibly the one that I can say most about from my research. I also think it's a more theoretical one. I couldn't say. I'm trying to do similar analysis to the one you saw in with respect to the general population, and trying to identify different currents in the population of people that might be more sympathetic to degrowth or less sympathetic to degrowth, and social-ecological transformations. And I would say it's from that analysis, I wouldn't say it's about, okay, do you need 2% or 3%, but it's more about how do you forge the links. You find different groups within the population that are open to social ecological transformation generally, but for very different reasons, and out of very different mentalities and very different ways of seeing the world and thinking about the world and feeling about it. And you need to find ways to connect these different interests and perspectives within the societies of the North as well. I'm looking at German society and finding 11 different kinds of mentalities that you need to find ways to link up to each other. And I'm finding that in theory, you could organize majorities for a social ecological transformation within German society, but you need to find the things that you can use as strategic levers or as topics around which to rally. And at the same time, you also need to be very aware of those forces in society that are simply your opponents. And I agree with Andreas on that. There are certain groups, and I'm finding that sociologically, that are simply not going to be part of a degrowth coalition. We know that, and we just need to accept that, and we need to think about how do we organize majorities for societal change that will be able to decide that we'll have societal change, even if some people believe it shouldn't happen.
Thanks a lot, Dennis. I will pass on to Andreas and add a question, Andreas, which was specifically for you, from Ernest, saying, how is it possible to imagine a deglobalization of the global economic system without degrowth? And I will also let this be your closing statement, Andreas.
That's a very nice question, because I really wanted to start exactly with this in continuation what Miriam said, and I totally agree with her comment, and just add on this. For me, social-ecological infrastructures have a challenge, and the challenge is to organize territorialized life, not at the cost of other regions in this world. So it has to go hand in hand with some type of selective deglobalization. The mobility system is very clear. I mean, mass tourism, global supply chains, all this is a key impediment to degrowth. The same with the food system. And I would argue that it is would be one of the key contributions of Europe for world development if we would go a little bit towards deglobalization in becoming less requiring less resources from other parts of the planet, and our food system is exactly dependent on a certain division of labor, which is destructive. In this sense, I would argue degrowth and deglobalization somehow have to go hand in hand, and that's a further argument why building territorialized social-ecological infrastructures are so important. Now to some of the questions. I painted a very nice picture of Red Vienna because I had very few minutes, and everything I said is true, but there is a lot that can be added in more critical ways. And the point is, to respect to the second question, Red Vienna has transformed the city, and Red Vienna has been co-opted as well. Vienna is a capitalist city. It's a consumerist city. It's not different from many other cities in the world. Also, we have a more decommodified education, health system, and in other respects, we are indeed, I would say, somehow role model, but there was and is co-option, and that is probably unavoidable, and that's why all that Miriam told about Latin America is valid in every context. You have successes, you have defeats, back and forth, and that's why we have to be involved as activists, but activists not only in the sense of civil society activists, also as engaged public servants, engaged academics, and citizens in general. So what I really enjoyed also is this idea of ecosystems of alternatives, and I think here we have somehow an agreement. And when I criticize communities and bottom-up initiatives, I don't criticize them in itself, because I think they are very important and very inspiring. I criticize if they don't acknowledge that they are one species of diversity, of the biodiversity of an alternative. And that they have to be added with other actors that are more involved in combating opponents to degrowth, and they have to be added with actors that build, and now I would add at the end a word that I find very important, which has not been mentioned so far, another hegemony. And when I talk about coercion, I mean to impose a certain society where people are prohibited to live at the cost of others. And this, I think, will imply some type of state agency and some type of authority with all the problematic aspects that implies. And in this sense, I think I have touched at least at some of the questions asked for.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Andreas. We are also running out of time, but I want to give Dennis and Miriam 30 seconds each for a wrap-up comment. So please, Dennis, I hand you the word first.
Yeah, just one point I obviously forgot. I think climate is going to be for the years to come a central issue. If there's any rallying issue for the years to come, at least in Europe, I think it's going to be climate and ending fossil fuel extraction. There's a lot of struggles going on around that, and I think that's also an opportunity to forge broader alliances than we have at the moment.
Thanks a lot. That was really brief. And please, Miriam.
Yeah, maybe I want to take up the question of scale again and just answer to Andreas's last comment. I think that we should not idealize the possibilities of the nation state in order to exert coercion, as you just mentioned, to prohibit people to live at the costs of others, because what states actually do is mostly the contrary. They encourage people to live at the costs of others and encourage corporations to dispossess and to appropriate the livelihoods of others. So this brings me back to the ecosystem notion that we have many successful examples of self-regulation, of communitarian or municipal or smaller scale self-regulations, and that they also can bring a critical mass in expanding horizontally. And it must not necessarily be our focus that this has to happen from the national scale, especially in world regions where the national scale is occupied by fascists or some other people, So just a glimpse of hope for those world regions. Not everything is lost, but we can play on all these scales, and we have to do it, I think.
Thanks a lot, Miriam, for those final optimistic words. And I'm afraid I just have to finish now because we have less than 2 minutes left. And of course, I want to thank all the speakers for the really passionate debate. And unfortunately, just with 3 people, we didn't manage to answer all the questions. So also thank you to the audience and thank you for the questions you sent. Please continue the debate in the Discord room afterwards. I also want to thank the IT helpers, Joelle and Maya, who you didn't see behind the scene. And then I want to invite you, the audience, to please stay in the room and don't close webinar down, because there will be some nice dinner entertainment continuing in this space afterwards. So we, the panelists, will leave, but you please stay while you also have the Discord chat open for continuing the discussion. And also for contributing to the harvesting recording there in Discord. So with that, I think that was all I needed to say. Thank you again to all panelists. Thank you for joining. Have a nice dinner and see you all soon. And to the panelists, we just close our browsers. Bye.